On the verge of losing their home of 75 years, a family stood frozen, their future hanging by a thread. The old porch they'd gathered on for generations. The walls that held every birthday, every storm, every silent prayer, about to be sold to the highest bidder. But then, in that packed courthouse, J.D. Vance rose. In a room thick with tension, he defied not just the bank's lawyers, but a judge whose fairness had long been questioned. And with a single unexpected revelation, he turned the tide, silencing the room, forcing powerful men to pause, and reminding a forgotten town of its strength. What did J.D. say that day? What truth forced the system to stop? And why does this moment still echo across America today? Before we begin, know this. While this story is dramatized for impact, inspired by the spirit of real struggles and values, the emotions you'll feel are true. It's a tribute to those who fight quietly, for homes, for families, for dignity, in towns that power too often overlooks. Now join us as we step into that fateful courtroom. This isn't just a story, it's a moment that could change how you see justice. Tom Carter had always believed a man's worth was written in the walls of his home. And in this house, a weathered two-story frame that stood like an old soldier on the edge of town, every scar in the wood, every creak of the floor told the story of his family's fight to endure. It wasn't just a house, it was the Carter legacy. 75 years of births, funerals, Christmas mornings, and long, hard winters survived together under its roof. On that Tuesday morning, the mail came late. Tom heard the squeal of the rusty mailbox hinge as the postman's truck rattled away. He wiped his hands on his jeans, stepping off the porch where he'd been mending a broken shutter. The sun was sharp, but the air smelled of rain. A storm was coming. He felt it in his bones. The envelope lay alone in the box, thick, official, its return address printed in bold black ink. Notice of foreclosure proceedings. The words blurred for a moment as his hands trembled. He glanced toward the house, toward the window where Lisa was folding laundry, humming to herself, unaware. The kids' laughter echoed faintly from the backyard. Tom shoved the letter deep into his pocket and walked back toward the tool shed, heart pounding harder with every step. Not now, not like this. Maybe I can fix this before she knows, before they know. But secrets, like debts, have a way of finding daylight. That evening, as the sky darkened and thunder grumbled low beyond the hills, Tom sat on the porch alone, staring out at the road, the letter heavy in his pocket like a stone. He hadn't opened it. He didn't need to. He knew what it said. Inside, Lisa finished tucking the kids into bed. She came out, wrapped in an old cardigan, and sat beside him. "Storm's coming," she said softly. Tom only nodded. She reached for his hand and felt the paper crinkle. Slowly, she drew it out. "What's this, Tom?" His silence was answer enough. Lisa unfolded the letter by the porch light. Her face tightened as she read, the color draining from her cheeks. The words on the page seemed to shout in the night. "Final notice. Auction date set." For a moment, neither spoke. The house groaned softly as the wind picked up, as if it, too, felt the weight of what was coming. Finally, Lisa whispered, "Tom, why didn't you tell me? I thought maybe I could stop it first. I didn't want you to worry." But the worry had come anyway, crashing over them like the storm that soon broke, rain splattering the porch, the smell of wet pine filling the air. Inside, unseen, little Ellie stood at the staircase, clutching the banister. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the sound of fear. She understood that something precious was slipping away. The rain had eased by morning, but the storm lingered in the Carters' hearts. Sleep had been thin and restless. Tom lay awake long after Lisa had drifted off, listening to the roof drip and the creak of the old house settling. With dawn came a resolve, fragile but burning. He had to face the bank, had to try something before this nightmare became real. He left early, before the children woke, not wanting them to see the strain etched into his face. The truck coughed to life, tires splashing through puddles on the muddy road into town. The streets of Jackson Hollow looked no different than usual. The faded signs, the boarded windows. But Tom felt as if every building watched him pass, as if even the town knew what was at stake. The bank sat at the corner of Main and 3rd, a squat brick building with a worn flag hanging limp in the still morning air. Tom hesitated on the steps, glancing at his reflection in the glass door. The reflection of a man fighting to hold his world together. He squared his shoulders and stepped inside. The warmth of the lobby did nothing to thaw the chill in his chest. The manager, a man named Bledsoe, who Tom had known since school days, looked up from behind his desk, eyes guarded, smile thin. "Tom," Bledsoe said, as if greeting a ghost. "Didn't expect to see you in today." Tom swallowed hard. "Need to talk about the house. There's got to be a way, something we can work out." Bledsoe's gaze shifted, uncomfortable. His fingers drummed the desk. "It's out of my hands, Tom. The foreclosure process has started. There's policy, and then there's what I can do. My hands are tied. But I've lived there my whole life. My kids—" Tom's voice cracked. "Bledsoe, we grew up together." "I'm sorry, Tom. I truly am. There's just nothing I can offer at this point." The conversation ended not with anger, but with the heavy weight of resignation. Tom left the bank as he'd entered, shoulders set, jaw tight. But inside, something had cracked. Outside, he thought he heard the whispers before he even saw the faces. The clerk at the gas station across the street, the woman sweeping the stoop of the diner. Small-town eyes that had seen this before. Families losing homes, good men brought low. He kept his head down and climbed into his truck, feeling the gaze of the town like rain that wouldn't stop. Back at home, the house felt quieter than usual, as if even the walls were waiting for the next blow. Lisa stood at the window, watching him pull up. She knew without asking. The look on his face told the whole story. He stepped onto the porch, opened his mouth to speak, but she shook her head gently. There was no need, and that was when she decided. The weight couldn't rest on Tom's shoulders alone. That night, after the kids were in bed, and Tom sat silently at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, Lisa reached for a pen. The paper shook beneath her hand as she wrote. Not to a lawyer, not to a bank. She wrote to a man she had never met, but whose name she'd heard spoken in town with a kind of reverence. J.D. Vance. Her words were simple, plain, but full of the quiet desperation of a mother fighting for her family's future. As she sealed the envelope, she glanced at Tom, and for the first time that day, hope, fragile and small, flickered in her heart. Night fell heavy over Washington, the city's glow flickering faintly through J.D. Vance's office window. The Capitol dome loomed in the distance, bathed in pale light, a reminder of all the promises made beneath it, and all the promises broken. Inside, the office was quiet but for the faint ticking of a worn clock on the wall and the soft hum of the air vent. J.D. sat alone at his desk, shoulders slightly slumped, fingers absently turning a brass paperweight over and over in his hand. On the desk before him, scattered papers and reports blurred together. Immigration policy briefs, budget proposals, committee schedules. But his eyes weren't on any of them. They were on the small, battered photo propped up against his lamp. Mama. Her gaze in that picture was the same as it had been in life. Fierce, unyielding, and proud in a way no hardship could take from her. The city around him was quiet at this late hour, but inside J.D., a storm brewed, the kind that came not from anger, but from the weight of knowing there was always more to fight for, more to do. A soft knock broke the stillness. His aide, a young man with tired eyes, stepped in and set a small stack of mail on the edge of the desk. "Sorry to interrupt, sir. These just came in. Figured you'd want to see them before morning." J.D. nodded, already half lost in thought, but his hand reached automatically for the top envelope. His thumb paused on the return address. Lisa Carter, Jackson Hollow, Kentucky. Something about the name, the place, tugged at him. Jackson Hollow. He knew that town. He knew what it meant to come from a place like that. A place the maps forgot, but the people never did. He slit the envelope open carefully, unfolded the letter, and read. Lisa's words weren't polished, they weren't grand, but they didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a mother's fear, of a wife's quiet strength, of a family standing on the edge of losing everything that mattered. She wrote of Tom, a good man who'd worked his whole life, now facing the loss of the only home his children had ever known. She wrote of their house, how it wasn't much to look at, but it was theirs, and how she didn't know where else to turn. JD felt the lump rise in his throat before he realized it. His fingers brushed the edge of Mama's photo as if to draw strength from it. His mind drifted back to his own childhood, to the nights Mama sat at the kitchen table counting crumpled bills, trying to stretch a dollar far enough to keep the lights on, to the sound of her voice, steady and certain, saying, "Don't let them tell you this ain't your home. Don't let them take what's yours." He folded the letter with care, set it down, and sat back in his chair, staring out at the Capitol dome once more. The silence in the room felt different now, not empty, but filled with purpose. "Not on my watch," JD whispered, the words barely audible, but solid as steel. And as the city slept, JD Vance made a silent vow. He would not let Jackson Hollow become another forgotten town, with another family's story ended by a system that no longer saw them. He would answer the call. The sun was just cresting the hills as JD Vance steered his truck off the interstate and onto the narrow two-lane road that would carry him into Jackson Hollow. The city had faded behind him hours ago, replaced by the vast, quiet stretch of Appalachian country. Rolling hills blanketed in mist, forests dark with shadow, and towns so small they barely made a mark on the map. But Jackson Hollow had once meant something. And now, as JD drove deeper into its heart, he felt the weight of what had been lost. The first thing he saw were the factories, or what was left of them. Rusted hulks of steel and brick loomed like skeletons on the edge of town, their broken windows staring blankly at the empty lots where men once lined up for work at dawn. Weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt, reclaiming ground once busy with trucks and voices. A battered sign leaned at the town's entrance: Jackson Hollow, home of honest hands. The paint had faded so much the words were barely legible. JD slowed as he passed the main street. The storefronts, once proud with hand-painted signs and bright awnings, now stood silent, windows dark, many boarded up. The old barber shop where his uncle used to get a trim was gone, its door chained shut, a notice stapled crookedly across it: "For sale. No offers refused." Porches sagged under the weight of years without repair. Fences leaned, paint peeled, and roofs bore the patchwork scars of too many storms, weathered without enough money for proper fixes. Laundry lines flapped in backyards. A few kids kicked a flat soccer ball along a gravel drive, their laughter thin against the quiet. But it wasn't just the buildings. It was the people. As JD's truck rolled through town, faces turned toward him. From the corner of the gas station where an old man sat whittling on a stump, from behind the dusty windows of the diner, from porches where folks rocked slowly in silence. Recognition flickered in some eyes, a mix of surprise and guarded curiosity. JD Vance, the boy who'd made it out, the man from the news. Some looked away quickly, unwilling to hope. Others held his gaze a beat longer, as if weighing what his return could mean. He felt it in the air, that blend of pride and pain, of wanting to believe and fearing disappointment again. How many promises had been made to towns like this? How many visits from politicians, cameras in tow, had left nothing but empty words? JD parked at the edge of the small square where the old courthouse stood, its columns cracked, flag limp on its pole, but still standing like the town itself. He sat a moment in the truck, letting the engine tick down, the quiet settle around him. The letter from Lisa Carter lay on the seat beside him, the corners soft from being read and reread on the long drive. He glanced at it once more, then out at the town. Not on my watch, he thought again, this time not as a promise, but as a quiet battle cry. He opened the door, boots hitting the cracked pavement, and the sound echoed faintly. The first step of what would not be just a visit, but a stand. JD crossed the square, boots scuffing against the cracked pavement, the courthouse fading behind him as he made his way toward the small side street where the Carter house stood. The wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth, mingling with the quiet hum of a town holding its breath. Every step brought him closer to the place at the heart of Lisa's letter, and to the family whose struggle now rested, in part, in his hands. The Carter house sat at the edge of a grove of old oaks, its paint faded, its porch sagging slightly at the corners, but it stood, stubborn and proud, like those who lived within. J.D. paused at the gate, hand resting briefly on the worn latch, taking in the cracked path leading up, the planter boxes empty but for weeds, the screen door patched in two places with tape. Then he stepped forward, boots creaking on the wooden steps, and knocked gently on the frame. The door opened after a moment, and Tom Carter stood there, a man hardened by work and worry, but with eyes that still held a glint of the strength that had built this home. His handshake was firm, his grip calloused, but there was a heaviness to it too, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders and refused to let go. "Mr. Vance," Tom said, voice low, respectful but cautious. "Call me J.D., he replied, his own voice steady, kind. Tom nodded, stepping back to let him in. Inside, the house smelled of wood stove heat and something simmering, the kind of smell that said no matter how tight things got, this was still a place where family gathered, where dignity lived in the details. The living room was clean, though the furniture had seen better days. A threadbare rug covered the scuffed floorboards. On the mantel, faded photographs showed generations of Carters. Proud faces, wedding portraits, children posed stiffly in Sunday best. Lisa appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression tense but hopeful. She offered a small, tired smile and motioned J.D. to the table where bowls of stew waited. Humble fare, served on mismatched plates, but offered with the kind of hospitality that said, "You're welcome here. We may not have much, but what we have, we share." J.D. sat, his notebook open on his knee, listening more than speaking. Tom and Lisa told their story in simple, unembellished words. The factory layoffs, the mounting bills, the loan that seemed reasonable at first and then turned on them. Their voices were steady, but beneath the surface ran the quiet desperation of people who had done everything right and still found themselves cornered. The children, Honor, Ellie, and Sam, sat quietly at the edge of the room, eyes wide, polite, but shadows of worry in their faces that no child should wear. J.D. asked questions gently, jotting notes as he did, his manner more like a neighbor than an official. He didn't promise what he couldn't give, but with every word he wrote down, every detail he gathered, it was clear. He wasn't just listening. He was building something, a case, a plan, a stand. As the meal ended and he closed his notebook, J.D. met Tom's gaze and saw not defeat, but the flicker of something else. The smallest spark of hope rekindled by the simple fact that someone had come, someone was listening, and maybe, just maybe, someone would fight. Night fell gently over Jackson Hollow, the kind of night that wrapped the town in stillness, where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The meal was long finished, the Carters settling into their quiet routines, but J.D. lingered outside, stepping down from the porch into the cool evening air. The door clicked shut softly behind him, and for a moment he just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes lifted toward the sky. The stars stretched wide and bright above the dark hills, a reminder of how small this town was, how small any one man could feel in the face of so much stacked against him. But J.D. didn't feel small, not tonight. He began to walk, boots crunching softly on the gravel road, each step steady, measured. The town lay in shadow now, the streetlights few and far between, their yellow glow barely reaching the cracked sidewalks and boarded windows. J.D. passed the empty storefronts, the silent gas station, the diner with its stools turned up on the counter. All places that had once been alive with chatter and work, now waiting, as if unsure what came next. He passed porches where rocking chairs swayed empty in the breeze, dogs that watched him with curious eyes but did not bark, yards where bicycles lay forgotten in the grass. It was a town of echoes of what had been and what still stubbornly held on. But as he walked, J.D. heard another voice, one that lived in memory but felt as clear as if she stood beside him. Mama. That voice, sharp as cracked leather, steady as the hills themselves. You fight for your own, or you're no man at all. She'd said it more than once, back in those days when bills came due and no help came, when it fell to family to be the line between survival and surrender. JD stopped at the edge of a small rise, looking back toward the Carter house. In the darkness, it glowed faintly. Warm light spilling from one window, the house itself looking worn, but defiant, like the family inside. It was just a house, and yet not just a house. It was shelter, history, a promise made by one generation to the next. He stood there for a long moment, arms folded, feeling the weight of it all, the town's silence, the Carters' struggle, the system that seemed blind to it. Then softly a vow rose in him. Not loud, not for anyone's ears but his own. "We'll fight this," JD said, the words carried off into the night. And with that, he turned, heading back toward his truck, toward the work ahead. The town might have been forgotten by others, but not by him, not tonight. The morning after his walk beneath the stars, JD Vance rose early, the promise he'd made still sharp in his mind. The town stirred slowly outside his window. The hum of an old truck passing, the bark of a dog in the distance. But JD was already at work. He spread his papers across the small table in his rented room at the inn, legal pads, copies of loan agreements, foreclosure notices, and bank statements layered like pieces of a puzzle he intended to solve. The coffee in his cup went cold as he read line after line, tracing the paper trail that had led the Carters to the edge of ruin. What he found made his jaw tighten and his pen scratch faster against the page. The foreclosure notice had been issued on a timeline that pushed every boundary of fairness, mailed out with barely the minimum notice required by law, dates chosen to fall over a holiday weekend, giving the family less time to respond. JD marked it in red, his mind already turning over how to present that detail to a judge. The loan itself, what had seemed at first glance to be a straightforward refinance, hid layers of predatory terms. Adjustable rates that ballooned at precisely the moment Tom's work hours had been cut. Late fees stacked so aggressively that the balance grew faster than any payment could chip away. And buried deep in the fine print, JD found clauses that made his stomach turn. Provisions allowing the bank to shift payment deadlines without direct notice. Loopholes designed to keep the borrower always a step behind. JD leaned back, rubbing his temples, the weight of what he saw pressing down hard. It wasn't just carelessness. It was a machine. A cold, calculated process built to squeeze families like the Carters, until there was nothing left but the keys to the front door handed over in defeat. The file on the auction date lay open before him, the final insult. It was set for just 2 weeks out, a date chosen with brutal efficiency. Too soon for most families to raise funds, too soon to organize meaningful help, but just long enough to appear lawful. The gears were turning fast, and if he didn't act, the house that glowed warm in the dark the night before would soon be another hollow shell on a street full of them. JD stood, stretching the tension from his back, and gazed out the window at the town below. The courthouse dome gleamed faintly in the morning sun, a reminder of the fight ahead. His notes filled 2 pages now, dense with facts, figures, questions, and ideas. This wasn't just a fight for one house. This was a fight against a system that had learned to grind good people down so slowly they didn't see the defeat coming until it was too late. JD gathered the papers into a neat stack, his mind sharpening with purpose. The machine might be powerful, but it wasn't invisible. Not anymore. Outside, the town carried on, unaware of how close it stood to losing another piece of itself. But JD knew. And as he stepped out into the light of day, he knew this. The machine was moving, but so was he. JD didn't waste time. The stack of papers he'd marked up that morning still sat on the table, corners curled slightly from his grip. The details were fresh in his mind. Too fresh to let sit. With the weight of what he'd uncovered, the next step was clear. The machine needed a voice on the other end of the line. And so JD picked up his phone, found the number for the bank's legal counsel listed at the bottom of the foreclosure packet, and dialed. The line rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "This is Edward Langley, Regional Counsel for First Valley Financial. How can I help you? JD introduced himself, his tone firm but civil, laying out who he was and why he was calling. There was a brief pause on the other end. A pause JD recognized. The sound of someone recalibrating their response, realizing this wasn't just another desperate borrower, but someone with influence, someone who might complicate things. Well, Senator Vance, Langley said, his voice as polished as glass, I appreciate you reaching out, but I'm afraid the matter involving the Carters is fairly far along. The foreclosure proceedings are within legal parameters. We're following standard policy. JD kept his voice measured. I've reviewed the documents, Mr. Langley. The notice timing, the terms of the loan. You and I both know this wasn't designed for fairness. There's room here to reconsider, to work something out that doesn't destroy this family. Another pause. JD could almost hear the executive choosing his words like moves on a chessboard. I'm sure you understand, Senator. This isn't personal. It's just business. There's a process and the Carters' file is moving through it. Nothing personal? JD repeated, his voice quieter now, but edged with steel. His hand tightened around the phone, knuckles white. To you, maybe. But to them, it's their home, their history, their future. Langley's tone didn't change. If anything, it softened in that careful, detached way that professionals use when they want to end a call without conflict. I respect your position, sir, but I have no authority to alter the process at this stage. I'm sure you understand. JD stared out the window at the courthouse square, heart pounding beneath his calm surface. The machine was moving exactly as designed. Polite words, firm refusals. No room for human cost. I understand perfectly, JD said at last, and we'll see about that. He ended the call, setting the phone down with deliberate care, as if the force of his frustration might shatter it otherwise. Outside, the town went about its day, unaware of the conversation that had just ended. A conversation that, to the bank, was routine, but to JD marked the line where negotiations stopped and the fight began. JD gathered his notes once more, now with renewed purpose. The machine had spoken. Now it was his turn. When JD left the inn that afternoon, the weight of the call with Langley still sat heavy on his shoulders, but his resolve had hardened. The polite refusal, the cold logic of just business, it had drawn the line. And JD Vance had no intention of standing quietly on the wrong side of it. He made his way across town with purpose, stopping at the courthouse, at the records office, gathering copies of documents, filing the motions he could, and scribbling notes between meetings. The machine might have been well-oiled, but he knew how to spot the places where the gears could grind to a halt. Word of his presence spread faster than he expected. By evening, it was being whispered in the corners of the town's diner, passed between gas station clerks on smoke breaks, and mentioned in the quiet conversations after church service. JD Vance has come back. He's going to stand up for the Carters. He's coming to the auction. The news carried an energy that hadn't been felt in Jackson Hollow in a long time, a flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Inside the diner, Forks paused midway to mouse as folks talked low, glancing at the door as if half expecting JD to walk in at any moment. At the gas station, a mechanic wiped his hands on a rag, shaking his head. I'll give him this. Man's got guts, showing up for a lost cause. Outside the church, a group of older women stood in a cluster beneath the steeple's shadow, one whispering, "What can one man do anyway? The bank's already decided." But for every voice of doubt, there was another that spoke with quiet admiration. If he's willing to fight, maybe we should be too. JD felt those murmurs in the air as he walked through town that evening, his steps steady, mind turning over the arguments he'd make, the points he'd raise. His legal pad was filling fast. Bullet points about procedural errors, questionable timing of notices, fine print traps buried in the loan documents. He knew he'd need every fact, every piece of leverage, to have even the smallest chance of slowing the machine. But as he worked, another part of him, the part shaped by Mama's teachings, by years of seeing how numbers and laws could miss the human heart of a thing, began preparing something else. Words not for the judge's bench or the bank's counsel, but for the people who would be sitting in that courtroom, for the Carters, for the town that had been waiting too long for someone to say enough. He jotted a separate note at the bottom of the page, underlined twice. A house is more than wooden nails. By the time the courthouse bell tolled 8, JD was back at his table at the inn, his notes spread before him, the night pressing close against the windows. He worked by the glow of a single lamp, the same way Mama had done all those nights she fought to keep their world intact. Outside, Jackson Hollow braced itself, the coming auction no longer just a date on a paper, but a reckoning they all felt in their bones. Dawn broke cold over Jackson Hollow, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and breath, that reminded folks it was winter's edge, no matter what the calendar said. A thin frost dusted the courthouse steps as people began to gather, their boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. The bell in the old tower tolled 7 as the first of them arrived. Early risers, curious souls, those drawn by duty or dread or simple hunger to see what would unfold. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old wood, paper, and the faint trace of last night's cleaning polish. The heat clanked to life as bodies filled the space, their voices low, their faces tense. It wasn't often the room saw this many visitors. Usually it was traffic tickets or small claims, the ordinary business of a town trying to keep order. But today something different charged the air. Today dignity itself felt on trial. Reporters with notepads and camera crews with tired eyes slipped in, their equipment muted out of respect or perhaps caution. They'd caught wind of the story. A senator, a family, a fight at the heart of a town too often overlooked. They sensed the possibility of a headline that would stir more than a scroll past on a newsfeed. Locals filled the benches, their coats draped over their laps, hands folded or gripping paper cups of coffee gone lukewarm. Faces JD had seen before. At the diner, the gas station, on porches rocking slowly in the dusk, now gathered as witness to what felt like more than a house sale. There was the mayor sitting off to one side, expression unreadable. The pastor from the Baptist church sat near the back, Bible in hand, lips moving silently in prayer. Speculators were there too, men in suits that didn't quite fit the room, eyes sharp, briefcases at their feet. They spoke little, but their presence said enough. To them, this was a transaction, numbers on paper, another line item in a ledger. The Carters sat together at the front, Lisa's hands folded so tightly in her lap the knuckles had gone white. Tom's shoulders were square, but the weariness in his eyes betrayed the sleepless nights that had brought him here. Beside them sat JD, still focused, his notes in front of him, but his attention on the room, the mood, the weight of expectation pressing down on them all. The murmur of conversation rose and fell like a tide as more people filed in, filling every available space. The auctioneer, a man in his 50s with a well-worn gavel and a gaze that shifted between duty and discomfort, shuffled his papers at the podium, clearing his throat as if to remind the room of his authority. JD felt the tension crackling, a hum beneath the surface that no one dared break. He glanced at Lisa, offered the smallest nod, and she returned it, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but also with something steadier, the strength of a woman who would not let this day take what mattered without a fight. The courthouse clock ticked louder in the hush, each second bringing them closer to the moment when words, not papers, would decide the fate of a home, a family, and perhaps a little piece of the town itself. The hush in the courthouse deepened as the auctioneer shuffled his papers one final time, adjusting his glasses with a hand that trembled just slightly. The gavel in his other hand felt heavier than usual, as if it too understood that today's business was more than routine. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the stillness, and glanced at the clock as if hoping for a delay that wouldn't come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice formal but edged with unease, "we are here today to proceed with the court-ordered auction of the Carter property at 112 Willow Lane." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than they should, as if naming the house in this way stripped it of the memories and meaning that clung to its walls. JD felt Lisa's breath catch beside him, saw Tom's jaw tighten. Across the room, the spectators leaned forward, some with sympathy, others with cold curiosity, and a few with that glint of opportunity that always appeared where misfortune walked. The auctioneer looked out over the room, eyes skimming the crowd, and raised the gavel. "We'll open the bidding at $50,000. A pause. Then the soft rustle of movement as a man in a sharp gray suit, a developer's representative, JD guessed, lifted his hand. His expression was practiced indifference, the kind that came from having done this too many times to feel the weight of it anymore. And that was when JD rose. His chair scraped back against the wooden floor, the sound startling in the quiet, drawing every eye in the room. JD stood tall, his voice steady, carrying across the courtroom with a clarity that left no question of intent. "Objection," he said, his tone respectful but firm, as if he had every right to speak, and in that moment, no one dared argue he didn't. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off script. "Sir?" JD took a step forward, meeting the gaze of the man at the podium, then sweeping the room with his eyes, making sure no one missed his words. "Before we sell this home," JD said, "let's hear what we're selling." The room froze. The developer's hand hesitated midair, then dropped slowly to his side. The murmurs that had begun to rise from the benches faded into silence, as if the very walls leaned in to listen. Even the judge, seated quietly at the edge of the proceeding, tilted his head, watching with a mixture of curiosity and caution. JD's heart pounded, but his voice didn't waver. He gestured toward the Carters. "This isn't just a house on a lot. This isn't wood and shingles and a patch of ground. This is 75 years of a family's life. This is where children were raised, where storms were weathered, where every scar on the doorframe means a milestone, not a defect." His words filled the space that moments ago had been bracing for the cold mechanics of bidding. "And before we talk about price, we owe it to this town, to ourselves, to understand exactly what we stand to lose here today." The auctioneer lowered his gavel slowly, uncertainty flickering across his face. The room remained hushed, waiting. Not for the next bid, but for what JD would say next. The silence that followed JD's words felt heavier than the walls of the courthouse itself. It wrapped around everyone present, the bidders shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the reporters lowering their pens as if to listen more closely, the locals holding their breath as if their own futures balanced on what came next. JD let that quiet settle a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice steady, filling the space without needing to rise. "You all know this family," he began, his gaze moving from face to face. Neighbors, old classmates, men who'd worked with Tom, women who'd shared pews with Lisa. Tom Carter is a man who gave everything he had to his work, to his town, to his family. When the factory closed, he didn't quit. He picked up odd jobs, he worked nights. He did what a man does when times get hard. Lisa kept that home warm, kept food on the table, kept their children steady even when the world outside their doors seemed determined to break them down. JD paused, letting the truth of that sink in. He saw heads nodding, saw shoulders straighten, as if people remembered, as if they too had lived parts of that story. "And yet here we are," JD continued, spreading his hands to take in the whole room, the gavel, the legal forms stacked on the judge's bench. "We're here not because this family failed, but because the system failed them, because notices were sent at times designed to go unseen, because loan terms were written to confuse and to trap, because the machine of foreclosure moves faster than the hands that built the house it's come to claim." The judge shifted slightly, his fingers tapping once on the arm of his chair, a small but telling sign that JD's words had reached him. "And I ask you all," JD said, his voice dropping just enough to draw people in closer, "is this who we are? A town that watches quietly as one of its own is pushed out, not by misdeeds or neglect, but by paperwork and fine print? A community that lets a home, not just a building, but the place where a family's life is written, be reduced to an auction lot number?" JD reached into his pocket and drew out a folded paper, a note he'd scrawled the night before, the words of someone who'd shaped him. His fingers smoothed it open, and he read, "My mama used to say, a nation great enough to put a man on the moon shouldn't take his house." The line hung in the air, simple and raw, and for a moment it felt as if the room itself exhaled as one. Even the bidders who had come expecting nothing but business looked down, their confidence shaken by the weight of the truth spoken. JD stepped back slightly, his hands resting lightly on the back of the bench before him. "I'm not asking for charity," he said, quieter now but with every word clear. I'm asking for conscience, for fairness, for us to remember who we are before we lose one more piece of ourselves." The judge hesitated, his gaze moving slowly from JD to the Carters and back again. The auctioneer remained frozen, gavel lowered, unsure whether to proceed or wait. And in that breathless pause, the entire courthouse, every heart inside it, seemed to beat as one, waiting to see what would come next. For a moment after JD's final words, the courthouse remained utterly still, as if no one dared disturb the weight that had settled over the room. The auctioneer, gavel lowered, glanced at the judge for direction, his confidence fraying at the edges. The judge, hands folded before him, took in the faces of the Carters, the bidders, and finally JD, measuring not just the man, but the truth in his plea. Then came the sound that broke the stillness, the clearing of a throat, the shifting of a chair, as the bank's lawyer, a polished man in a crisp suit, his tie perfectly knotted, rose from his seat. His voice, when it came, carried the practiced smoothness of one used to these rooms, these proceedings. "Your Honor, with all due respect, while Mr. Vance's remarks are certainly moving, we are here today under clear legal authority. The foreclosure process followed the proper procedures, and the property is rightfully before this court for auction." But the lawyer's words rang thinner than they should have, the certainty behind them cracked by the quiet force of what JD had laid bare. And when the judge spoke, his tone was no longer routine. "Mr. Langley," the judge said, leaning forward slightly, eyes sharp beneath heavy brows, "I have some questions regarding the timing of the notices served to the Carters. Can you provide documentation showing that the required notice period was fully satisfied?" Langley hesitated, shuffling papers in his briefcase with hands that moved a little too quickly. The room watched as he pulled out a sheaf of forms, flipping through them, searching for dates that should have been at his fingertips. "Of course, Your Honor," he said, but the smoothness had slipped. "I believe you'll find everything in order." The judge didn't look away. "I'm asking for the proof. Show me where it is." Langley's fingers fumbled the edge of a page, his polished exterior now visibly strained. JD stood quietly, not gloating, not pushing, letting the facts he'd uncovered speak louder than any further words could. He had planted the seed, and now the truth was working its way into the cracks of the bank's case. "And the loan terms," the judge continued, voice firm, measured. "Mr. Vance raised concerns about predatory adjustments, hidden fees. I want clarity on that. I want transparency today." A ripple moved through the courtroom, people sitting straighter, leaning in, sensing the shift. The machine that had seemed unstoppable was stuttering, its gears grinding as questions it hadn't been built to answer came to the fore. Langley tried to recover, citing generalities, policies, industry norms, but the judge's gaze stayed steady, unmoved by practiced words. JD finally spoke, his tone respectful but firm. "Your Honor, this is all I ask, that we slow this process long enough to ensure fairness, that no home, no family is lost to oversight or convenience." The judge nodded slowly, then looked back at Langley. "You'll provide the documentation. Until then, this auction does not move forward." And in that instant, the momentum shifted. The machine faltered, and the room, heavy with held breath, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the fight wasn't over after all. The judge's words echoed in the charged stillness of the room. "Until then, this auction does not move forward." It was as if the courthouse itself had exhaled, the collective tension easing, but only for a moment. JD felt that fragile pause, that space where hearts and minds hung between what had been and what might still be saved. He knew this was the moment to reach beyond legal briefs and loopholes, to remind this town, these people, of something deeper than contracts and clauses. He turned from the judge's bench, his gaze sweeping over the room, pausing at familiar faces. The pastor clutching his Bible a little tighter, the clerk from the gas station who'd looked away the day before, the old woman who always kept a candle in her window for her late husband. He saw in their eyes the struggle of wanting to hope and fearing the cost of it. JD took a slow breath, and his voice, when it came, was steady but carried the weight of something personal, something real. "This isn't just about the Carters' home," he said, and the room quieted further, as if the walls themselves leaned in to hear. This is about who we are, about what we let stand, and what we stand up for. He let the words settle, watched as doubt gave way to something else in the faces before him. When a family loses a house like this, not because they failed, but because a system failed them, we lose more than wood and shingles. We lose part of ourselves. Our honor's on trial here, not just theirs. He saw it then, faces softening, the skepticism that had hardened some gazes beginning to crack. The developer's rep shifted uncomfortably. The bidders who had come certain of their advantage now looked anywhere but at JD. The courthouse felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were pressing in to hold the truth of his words closer. JD's voice lowered slightly, drawing people in, making the moment intimate despite the crowd. My mama taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he's willing to protect. A town's no different. We protect each other, or we're no better than the coldest ledger in some bank's file. A murmur of agreement rippled through the benches, soft at first but growing, as if people were remembering themselves, remembering the ties that made Jackson Hollow more than just a place on a map. Even those who had come as skeptics, men who'd said, "What can one man do?" felt the pull of something larger now. Eyes glistened in the morning light filtering through the high windows, and in that fragile space between words, the room felt united not by law, but by shared conscience. JD let his hands rest on the back of the bench before him, the fight in his posture, but the invitation in his voice. I can stand here and speak, he said, but it's what we all choose to stand for that will decide what happens next. And as the judge watched, silent for now, and the bank's counsel shuffled his papers without finding an answer, the power of one voice had become the power of many hearts remembering who they were and what they were willing to defend. The courtroom felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of words that had struck deeper than anyone expected. JD's voice had quieted, but its echo lingered in the stillness. The judge remained silent, his gaze steady, the kind of look that spoke of thoughts turning, calculations being reconsidered. Across the aisle, the bank's attorney straightened his papers, with hands that trembled just enough for those paying attention to notice. He cleared his throat, a sound too loud in the hush that had settled over the room. Your Honor, Langley said at last, his tone struggling to recover its usual smoothness. In light of the questions raised and the seriousness of the concerns presented, I respectfully request a recess to review our documentation and confer with my client. It was a lifeline disguised as procedure, a chance to regroup, to find footing on ground that had shifted beneath him. The judge nodded once, slowly, his approval given not as a courtesy, but as a measured decision. Granted, he said, his voice low but firm. 15 minutes, we'll reconvene promptly. The gavel tapped the desk gently, not with finality, but as a pause, a breath held by an entire room. As people rose, the murmurs began, soft at first, then growing, threads of conversation weaving through the benches, the aisles, the corners where spectators lingered. Words like hope, fight, maybe drifted on the air. The doubters who had entered the room, certain of the outcome, now found themselves watching JD with something like belief flickering behind their eyes. JD remained still for a moment longer, letting the weight of what had just unfolded settle around him. Then he gathered his notes, tucked them into his folder, and turned to Tom, who had sat so silent through it all, his strength contained in the set of his shoulders and the tight grip of his hands folded in his lap. Come on, JD said quietly, his tone steady but warm. Let's get some air. Outside, the cold met them like a cleansing wave, sharp but welcome after the closeness of the courtroom. The sky had cleared, the sun fighting its way through the morning haze, casting pale light over the courthouse steps and the square beyond. The town looked the same, the worn buildings, the sagging porches, the rusted signs, but something felt different. The quiet of the street carried not just weariness now, but anticipation. Tom exhaled, a breath he seemed to have held since the gavel first fell. He looked at JD, his eyes tired but clearer than they had been in days. You think it made a difference? Tom asked, voice low, wary of hoping too much. JD met his gaze, and there was no hesitation in his reply. "We're not done," he said. "Not by a long shot." Tom nodded, a flicker of relief in his expression, as if those words alone were enough to steady him for whatever came next. They stood together in the cold, two men facing a fight that was far from over, but no longer theirs to face alone. Inside, the courtroom waited, the pause heavy with meaning, the echo of truth still hanging in the air. A promise that what came next would be shaped not by process alone, but by conscience, by courage, by the stand that had begun. By the time the courthouse doors closed behind JD and Tom, the town's heartbeat felt change. The silence that had filled the courtroom gave way to murmurs that grew stronger with every retelling. By noon, JD's words were on the lips of shopkeepers, echoed in the clatter of dishes at the diner, passed between neighbors leaning over fences. Jackson Hollow, long accustomed to watching its struggles go unseen, was beginning to stir. JD knew the law would take time, and time was the one thing the Carters didn't have. The auction date still loomed, its shadow stretching over every hopeful glance and whispered prayer. If they were going to stop the machine that had nearly crushed the Carters, they'd have to do more than wait for the courts. That night, JD sat at the small desk in his room at the inn, his legal pad now filled not with case notes but with plans. By the dim light of a single lamp, he drafted a simple appeal, a call for neighbors to stand together, to fight not just with words but with what they could give. A fund, nothing fancy, nothing official, just a jar on a counter, a collection plate at a church, a handshake promise turned into action. Before dawn broke, he'd visited the diner, the gas station, the post office, leaving small signs. "Every bit helps. Let's save this home together." The fund had no slogan, no campaign manager, only the urgency of a town asked to remember itself. And they answered. It started with coins dropped quietly into a mason jar at the diner. A waitress finishing her shift emptied her tips. A trucker passing through left his change. At the gas station, a mechanic folded a few crumpled bills into an envelope. Then the ripple spread wider. At the edge of town, an old miner, long retired, came by with a tin can, heavy with what he'd saved for no particular reason other than the habit of hard years. "Ain't much," he said, his voice rough with age, "but it's what I got." A widow who lived alone brought a worn purse to the post office, placing it quietly on the counter. "My man would have done the same," she said softly. Even the children joined in. A pair of siblings set up a lemonade stand along the main road, their handwritten sign reading simply, "For the Carter House." By day's end, their sticky, crumpled dollar bills filled a small shoebox. JD watched it all unfold with a mixture of gratitude and determination, moving from place to place, checking in, offering thanks, reminding everyone that no gift was too small. Each contribution felt like a piece of the town's soul being reclaimed, like a stitch in the fabric that had frayed too long. By nightfall, the jar at the diner was nearly full. The church collection plate overflowed with folded bills and notes of encouragement. The town, in its quiet, determined way, had begun to fight back, not with anger, but with unity. JD stood again outside the courthouse, looking out over the square, where lights twinkled in windows, where the town's heart beat stronger with every coin dropped and dollar shared. The machine still loomed, but for the first time, it was facing more than one man. It was facing a town that had remembered its soul. When the courthouse doors opened the next morning, the cold air rushed in alongside the townspeople who came not just to witness, but to stand with the Carters. Word of the fund had spread, and now even more faces filled the wooden benches. The faces of those who had given, those who had hoped, those who needed to see how it all would end. The atmosphere buzzed with a quiet determination that hadn't been there days before. The tension of dread had been replaced by the tension of possibility. JD sat beside Tom and Lisa at the front, his notes in order, his heart steady but alert. The judge entered, his robe flowing behind him like a weight carried with care, and as he took his seat, the room fell into respectful silence. He scanned the papers before him, the filings, the documents submitted by the bank's counsel, the motions JD had offered. But more than that, He looked at the people gathered, at the town that had risen up to be present. "The court has reviewed the documentation provided," the judge began, his voice clear, filling the room with authority but not harshness. "And it has considered not just the letter of the law, but the fairness of its application in this case." J.D. held his breath, watching the judge's face, reading the weight of what was to come in the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I find," the judge continued, "that the timing of the foreclosure notices did not provide sufficient opportunity for the Carters to respond adequately, and that certain loan terms raised legitimate concern about their fairness and transparency." A ripple of emotion moved through the room, relief mingled with awe. The bank's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward his client's representative seated behind him, who was already leaning in to whisper. "Given these findings," the judge said, pausing just long enough to draw every ear closer, "and given the extraordinary response of this community in support of the Carters, the court encourages the parties to resolve this matter equitably." It was an opening, an invitation, and the bank, sensing the tide that had turned against them, took it without hesitation. Langley rose, adjusting his tie. The polished confidence returned, but now tempered by necessity. "Your Honor," he said, "in light of the court's concerns and the unique circumstances presented, my client is prepared to offer a settlement that will allow the Carters to retain their home, subject to terms we will finalize with their counsel." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat, and then the dam broke. Applause erupted, unbidden but unstoppable, filling the courtroom with a sound that had not been heard within those walls in a very long time. The sound of relief, of victory, of a town remembering how to rejoice. Tom's shoulders sagged as if a weight had fallen away. Lisa's tears came freely now, not of sorrow, but of gratitude, of release. J.D. exhaled slowly, feeling the warmth of the moment soak into his bones. He glanced at the judge, offering the smallest nod of respect, a silent acknowledgement of fairness done. Outside, the bell tolled the hour, but inside, time seemed to pause, letting the triumph breathe, letting the town savor the moment when justice for once felt personal and real. The applause still echoed faintly in J.D.'s ears as they stepped out into the pale afternoon sun. The courthouse behind them stood taller somehow, as if the building itself shared in the relief that had swept through its walls. People lingered on the steps and in the square, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, trading smiles that came easier now. The Carters stood at the center of it all, surrounded by neighbors, friends, and strangers who no longer felt like either. Reporters, sensing the story had become more than just a legal victory, pressed closer. Microphones appeared, cameras angled for the perfect shot. J.D. could have walked away then, let the moment speak for itself. But he knew this was more than a single win. It was a chance to remind the country of what towns like Jackson Hollow still meant, of what they still deserved. He stepped forward, lifting a hand to quiet the voices, and when he spoke, his words carried the same steady strength that had filled the courtroom. "This wasn't about charity," J.D. began, his gaze sweeping over the small crowd, then finding the cameras beyond. "This wasn't about handouts or pity. We didn't ask for charity. We asked to be seen, to have this family, this town, recognized for its worth, not just in dollars, but in dignity." The square felt quiet, save for the soft whir of camera equipment, the scribble of pens trying to keep pace. "For too long," J.D. continued, "places like Jackson Hollow have been written off, forgotten by systems that move too fast to see who they run over. Families like the Carters have done everything right. They worked, they sacrificed, they held on. And when they stumbled, it wasn't failure. It was the weight of a machine designed to be too heavy for any one person to carry." He paused, letting that truth settle in, letting it reach not just those gathered, but the unseen audience he knew would watch this moment later. "But today," J.D. said, voice quiet but resolute, "this town remembered its strength. This community stood up and said, 'Not this time, not this house, not this family, and that matters.' That's what America's supposed to be." He could feel the emotion ripple through those listening. Not just pride, but the deep, aching recognition that what had happened here could and should happen elsewhere. J.D. stepped back as the questions began to fly, but he answered only briefly, his message clear, his purpose finished for now. The cameras caught it all. The firm set of his jaw, the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet nod he gave to Tom and Lisa, as if to say this was always about you, not me. By evening, the clip had spread. Online, it was shared and reshared, the caption simple. We didn't ask for charity, we asked to be seen. Communities far from Jackson Hollow watched and felt seen themselves. Towns in the Midwest, neighborhoods in the South, forgotten corners of the country where people understood too well the weight of being overlooked. The story was no longer just about one house. It had become a call, soft, steady, impossible to ignore, for all who had ever wondered if they still mattered in a world that seemed to have moved on without them. Spring had begun to soften the edges of winter by the time JD returned to the Carter home. The auction was now a memory, the courthouse victory a story told over coffee at the diner, in quiet conversations on front porches, and in the knowing glances exchanged between neighbors who had stood together when it mattered most. But today there were no cameras waiting at the gate, no reporters looking for a quote, just JD arriving alone in the soft morning light to see for himself what had been saved. The house stood much as it always had, sturdy, weathered, familiar, but with one small change that spoke louder than words. The porch was freshly painted. The boards, once gray and tired, now shone in warm, welcoming white. The trim edged in a hopeful blue that caught the sunlight and made the old place look almost new. The scent of paint still lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the sweetness of early blooms from Lisa's small garden out front. Tom met JD at the steps, wiping his hands on an old rag, his face relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. There was still the weight of years in his gaze, but today it rested lighter. Thought you'd forgotten about us, Tom said, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not a chance, JD replied, shaking his hand firmly. I figured I'd drop by, see how that porch turned out. Lisa appeared in the doorway, her smile easy. The lines of worry that had etched themselves deep now softened. Coffee's on, she called, and it was an invitation as warm as the spring breeze. Inside, the house felt different, not in its walls or its furniture, but in its air, its heart. The quiet now was one of peace, not fear. The mismatched plates on the kitchen table, the worn rug beneath their feet, the photos lining the mantel, all the small details of a life that had been fought for and won, now carried the simple joy of being where they belonged. They sat together over coffee, no speeches, no formalities. JD asked after the kids, how school was going, what plans lay ahead for the summer. Tom talked about patching the fence next, about maybe planting a few more rows in the garden. Lisa shared stories about neighbors who dropped by, about how the town still buzzed with the memory of what had happened, but was slowly settling back into its rhythm. There was laughter, soft and genuine, and in that small kitchen, the world outside, with its headlines and noise, seemed far away. JD didn't come with cameras or declarations. He came as a man keeping a promise, not just to help save a house, but to stand with the people inside it, to share a quiet cup and the comfort of knowing the fight had been worth it. The house stood, and with it, so did the dignity of a family, a town, and the idea that some victories don't need headlines to matter. As the days turned to weeks after JD's quiet visit with the Carters, the echoes of Jackson Hollow's stand began to ripple far beyond the town's worn streets and painted porch. The video clip of JD's speech outside the courthouse, "We didn't ask for charity, we asked to be seen," continued to make its rounds, shared and reshared across small towns and big cities alike, reaching places where hope had grown thin but hadn't disappeared entirely. It started quietly, like most real change does. A small town in Ohio set up a fund to save the Miller farm, where a family was fighting for closure after generations of tending the same soil. Then a group in West Virginia pooled resources to stop the auction of a local grocer's shop that had served its community for 50 years. From Minnesota to Mississippi, church basements, coffee shops, and fire halls became the gathering points for neighbors determined to do what they could to help their own. Inspired by a town that had proved such stands weren't just possible, they mattered. JD began to receive letters. At first just a few, then dozens, then stacks that filled baskets in his office. They came handwritten on lined paper, typed on old typewriters, scribbled on postcards and envelopes. Letters from farmers and factory workers, teachers and truck drivers, young families and old veterans. Thank you for reminding us we aren't invisible. Your fight gave us the courage to start ours. We thought no one saw us anymore. You did. JD read every one, some twice, some more. He kept them in a drawer near Mama's photo, each letter a quiet reminder that what had begun as a fight for one family had grown into something larger. A rekindling of belief, one small town at a time. And through it all, JD stayed steady, knowing that movements built on dignity don't need banners or parades. They need hearts willing to see, hands willing to help, and voices willing to speak when silence no longer serves. The sun had slipped low behind the hills, casting Jackson Hollow in the soft amber glow of dusk. The town, still and familiar, seemed to breathe with a calm it hadn't known in some time. JD walked slowly along the main road, hands in his pockets, taking in the quiet that settled like a blanket over the streets and porches. The worn storefronts, the gas station with its flickering sign, the diner where voices still murmured inside. They all looked the same, yet something beneath their surfaces felt changed. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and early spring blossoms, the kind of scent that made him think of Mama's back porch, of nights when the world felt hard, but home still felt strong. Each step along the cracked sidewalk echoed softly, the sound of boots on concrete, steady and sure. JD wasn't in a hurry. Tonight wasn't about speeches or plans. It was about seeing, truly seeing, what had been saved and what had been rekindled. He passed the Carter house, light spilling warm from its windows, voices inside carried on the evening air. Laughter, the clatter of dishes, the ordinary sounds of a family at peace. It made him smile, a quiet, private smile, one that belonged to no camera, no headline. Further down, he nodded to a neighbor sitting on a porch, rocking gently, tipping his cap in return. The small exchanges, the ones that bind a town together, felt stronger now, as if the cords had been tightened, the frayed ends tied anew. As JD reached the edge of town, where the road dipped toward the fields beyond, he paused, looking back. The courthouse dome glowed faintly in the fading light, the heart of a place that had remembered itself in the moment that counted. He drew a slow breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and spoke the words softly, not for anyone else's ears, but for his own, for Mama's memory, for every town like this one. We didn't just stop an auction, JD said. We reminded a nation who it is. And with that, he turned toward home, the night settling gently behind him, the promise kept. Sometimes a quiet stand speaks louder than the noisiest battles. JD's journey reminds us that dignity isn't saved by grand gestures, but by neighbors choosing to see one another, by small acts that build into something powerful. What touched me most is how a single voice, steady, respectful, and true, can awaken the conscience of a town and inspire a nation. This wasn't just about stopping an auction. It was about reminding people that fairness and community are still within our reach if we choose to act. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or been part of a moment where people came together and changed the outcome? I'd love to hear your story. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.